Welcome back to everything I know about chronic insomnia. In this video, I want to talk about coping because this is the first thing that we have to do. We need to stabilize. You can't heal before you can cope. First of all, we need to stabilize. We need to manage what we're going through. And from that point, when we have some stability, we can then start to see the way forward and what healing looks like. So in this video, I'm going to be talking all about coping. Now, the first priority is to make yourself feel safe. If you don't feel safe, nothing else can help, because the basic psychology and physiology of you will be constantly in an alert state, and there's no space for healing in that place. You have to find a way to get that respite, to stabilize, to come out of the trauma, if only momentarily, to then sort of see the light, so to speak, if only fleetingly, to be able to then move forward. So we're going to be looking at coping in this video and what that involves. Now, bit of controversy here. I want to talk about medication. Don't be afraid of medication. We are going to talk more in detail about medication later on, but I know from my own experience that medication can be a difficult one, because as much as some people rely on medication, not just for insomnia but for all manner of things, almost lazily rely on it without taking any responsibility or other action for what they can do to help themselves. A different response to medication is that you shouldn't need it, and actually to be guilty about it. I have had something that I like to term pill guilt, which is where you do take a pill, but you feel bad about it, and then you spend the next day sort of really low, or saying you shouldn't need to do it, and then tonight will be worse because I can't take a pill every night. So I just want to kind of take away the stigma, if there is one with you, about medication. It's here to help you, and sometimes it is the only way to stabilize. If you do not have the skill set yet, and that's perfectly understandable, to stabilize yourself, then this may be the only thing that can do it for you. So we can be grateful for that. Nobody wants to rely on medication for anything, but there's a time when it may be necessary. There's a very famous book from, I think, the 50s or 60s called Self-Help for Your Nerves. That is so influential that I believe it's still in print. And it's a really good read, actually. I recommend it, because this is really what we're talking about with this whole video series. It's self-help for your nerves. It's about your nervous system. And if your nervous system is misfiring, guess what? You're not going to sleep very well. But in it makes clear very early on that sometimes a sedative is needed. Sometimes a sedative, as in medication, is needed if you are in such a place of terror, and there just isn't any way out of that in the immediate term, and you can't heal whilst you're in that state. So if you have access to medication, obviously it has to be the right medication for you. I'm not a doctor, I can't advise you on anything, but don't be put off by it. It's there to help you and stabilize and just get you out of this rut, and then maybe you can move forward. But we're going to talk about meds in more detail in a later video. What else can you do to cope? Do sleep in. Do sleep in. All of the advice I've ever been given about insomnia is, get up at the same time every day, and what do they call it? They have this terrible term, sleep restriction. That's it. Well, isn't that a jolly phrase? Sleep restriction. So you go to a doctor and you talk about how you're not getting any sleep, and they talk to you about sleep restriction. Yeah, that's not that helpful, okay? That's like struggling for air and they tell you about oxygen restriction. So what does that mean? Although it's generally a good idea to be getting up at a similar time and going to bed at a similar time every day, and I would definitely recommend that when you're in a good phase, if you're not in a good phase, sleeping in, just gaining some safety, and if that means like being under the blankets, it's a good thing. I've found, anyway. Maybe some would disagree. But if I've had a terrible night, I'm presented with a choice. If I've been awake all night and I'm presented with the choice of getting up at 6, 7 a.m. and feeling like death and not wanting to interact with the world, not wanting to see anybody, just feeling terrible, or I can get up at 10 or even 11 but stay under the covers and at least be warm and by myself, then I have found that that can help me. Sometimes if I've had a really bad night, by staying in bed, even though I'm not sleeping, just getting up a bit later in the day rather than having the harshness of the early morning whilst you're feeling, because you need energy for early morning anyway. It's the time of the day when things get going. And I have found that if you just kind of skip that whole thing, now clearly not everybody can do this, I acknowledge that. I'm very fortunate in my work in that I can sleep in to some degree, obviously not like all day. And I totally acknowledge if that isn't an option for you. But where it is an option, or maybe at the weekends or something, I would say don't be afraid of it. Again, it's not about rules and sticking to sort of a military regimen. It's about feeling safe. And if staying in bed a bit when you've had a bad night and just dealing with the world a bit later in the day rather than first thing, and not getting up early just because somebody else told you that you should, then I would say do that and don't be afraid of that. Now that kind of feeds into a wider point about making your life work for you. And I've put in comments here, no self-violence. And there's no room for self-violence in any of this because, maybe part of the reason you're here is there has been self-violence. I don't mean literally just physical violence. I mean choosing against yourself, not voting for yourself, doing things that are harmful to yourself. So with this, it's about what can you do in your life to make your life work for you. And that really is a very open-ended question. What is your job? Are there other jobs where that would accommodate your current challenge with insomnia a little better? Or other employers in the same field? Or can you speak to your employer and get your hours to be made more flexible? Again, I acknowledge that this is not going to be an option for some people, but for some people it will be. I've known people for whom this was a thing where they did change work to deal with certain challenges in their life, not necessarily insomnia. You could call it constructing your world around your problem. I don't like to think of it that way. I like to think of it as making yourself feel safe. Again, we need to stabilise. So nobody's going to give you a medal if you do get up at 6 a.m. and go to work just because you believe you should be able to, but you spend the whole time feeling like death. That is violence against yourself. So it's really open-ended. Make your life work for you. I've talked about work, but what other areas? What are you doing right now that maybe you could do differently to support you getting through this challenge? And again, the underlining maxim of that is just no self-violence. Don't put yourself through anything that you can possibly avoid. Put yourself first and see what changes you can make. Now, you sleep more than you think. Talking about coping, this is just a bit of a side note here, but you do sleep more than you think. It's absolutely true. How do I know this is true? Because you wouldn't be alive if you slept as little as you think you do. And I've been here. We do sleep more than we realise. There's a lot of science behind this. I've looked into it. I've read a lot of it about how very often we are in a semi-lucid state. You're not in a deep sleep, but you're in a semi-lucid state, and actually, to some degree, sleep is still happening. So give yourself that comfort that you do sleep more than you realise, not only when you're having good periods, but even when you're having bad ones. It's very rare that you are genuinely awake the entire night. Now, I caveat that with the fact that the proof is in the pudding. So you might say, okay, great, science says that I sleep more than I think, but you know what, I still feel terrible. And I totally respect that. The knowledge that you probably sleep a little more than you acknowledge is not much comfort if you feel terrible. But it is something to at least maybe get yourself off your own back a bit about how you're not getting any sleep and what's that doing to my health and my interior and everything. you are getting a bit more sleep than you realise. Yes, it needs to improve, but you are getting that support of sleep. Even if you feel that you're awake, trust me, you're not always awake. Another thing that can help you cope is sleeping alone if you need to. Now, this is a dodgy one because people don't, if they're in relationships, they don't generally sleep alone. I do and have done for a long time. And again, you could say, well, this is kind of, again, just building your world around a problem. But I want to banish that thought about any of these steps. The point is to feel safe, okay? You can always come back from this later. If you start sleeping alone, and then as we go further and you go through your journey and you find your sleep is getting better, that doesn't mean you have to sleep alone for the rest of your life. You can get back into a shared bed if that's what you do. But consider it. If a major factor for you is that you sleep next to someone and maybe they make noises, they're tossing and turning, or they're getting up in the night, or just the fact that they're sleeping soundly and it's kind of really upsetting you because you don't get to sleep, definitely consider sleeping alone for now, okay? They're almost certainly going to be supportive of this if it's somebody close to you. Well, hopefully it is somebody close to you if you're sharing a bed, but who am I to judge? It's about making you feel safe, making yourself feel safe. That is the priority here. This is not something that's going to be set in stone. You can always come back to a shared bed later, and that goes for any of these things. They don't have to be permanent. Another thing as well, it was just a really minor one, but it's something I've noticed many times, is don't drink within a few hours of bedtime, okay? Because I don't have the science to back this up, but certainly in my own experience, if I'm in a bad period and I'm stressed about sleep, I tend to need the toilet in the night way more than if I do if I'm in good periods, okay? So when I'm in a good period, I can go to bed with an entire cup of tea and sleep right through and it's absolutely fine. When I'm struggling, I could have my last drink at like 6, 7 p.m. and still need the toilet 3 times in the night. It's just, I don't know the physiology of it, but generally if you're struggling, just eliminate that factor of, am I going to be woken up for the toilet? Because you just don't need that, right? So make sure you get your water intake and your drinks earlier in the day, and that can be something that can help as well. So what happens if you can't sleep? Well, this is one where there's some mixed advice. If you can't sleep, some people say you should get up and do mundane tasks like folding socks or some basic laundry. I guess folding socks is a kind of basic laundry, but let's not get hung up on that. Other people say, and I've seen this in different books, say that you should not get up because then you kind of train your mind to expect to get up and you should just stay there. I am definitely on the side of not just staying there. Now that isn't to say I get up and fold socks. What I do is I read. And I've come to realize that time when you're awake, when you'd like to be asleep, needs to be as enjoyable as possible. Now, I know how stupid that sounds. You've got work in the morning, you want to be asleep, this is terrible. Why the hell can't I just sleep? And you're telling me to enjoy this time. Yes, you have to, because otherwise you're going to make it even worse than it is. So, if you're awake, and remember, you can't force yourself to sleep. So if you're awake, make it as nice as possible. And what does that mean? Well, that's going to differ for different people. But for me, I like to do some easy reading. Now, what I mean by easy reading is nothing that is too mentally challenging. So, for example, I like to read a lot of popular science books. This is not the time for popular science books. There are better times of the day for me to try to get my head around Stephen Hawking talking about the evaporation of black holes. This is not that time. My favourite author is a guy called Tim Moore, who is mostly a travel writer. He does a lot of touring on bikes and goes around Europe and things. I just find him absolutely hilarious. I can reread his books forever, and that's a great example of a book that I would read at a time like this. Other examples might be like a Terry Pratchett book, something that is going to give you a chuckle, isn't going to make you think too much, which isn't to suggest that Terry Pratchett books don't make you think, because they absolutely do. But you know what I mean. It's an easy read, at least in terms of the story itself. And if you've read it before, then all the better, because you're doing even less work, but you can still enjoy it. Absolutely, don't get your phone out or your laptop, because what you're doing then is you're giving yourself way too much stimulus, and you're putting blue light, as it's called, into your system, and there's a reaction in the brain that reacts to that and then wakes you up even more. So this is not the time to pull your phone out. It's time to do something very much offline. And yeah, just try to enjoy it, Okay, you can't have first prize, which is sleeping. Make second prize as nice as it can be. And you're still resting and you're warm. That counts for something. I've had some really nice nights. It's weird to say now, but I've had some nice nights where I couldn't sleep, and I've read 50 pages of Tim Moore or Terry Pratchett or Adrian Mole or whatever. I've been really warm and pulled the blankets right up close to me. Sometimes I have a glass of oat milk as well next to me in case I wake up. And yeah, just make it as nice as you can. Don't treat it like you're in a torture dungeon. Treat it as like, well, okay, I'm in a holding pattern. Sleep will come. Maybe not tonight, but it will eventually come. And right now, it's up to me to make the best of it. Now, if you get up in the morning and you haven't slept, what can you do? Now, really, these points apply to anyone at any time of day or whatever kind of night you've had. But they apply particularly if you've had a bad night, I find. So if I've had a bad night, I have learned to go into a sort of autopilot where I double down on gentleness and niceness to myself. So be gentle and kind to yourself in whatever ways that means for you, in really tiny ways. So it could be, I'm going to give you a really weird sounding tiny example. It could be that you use a particular shower gel that you don't normally use, a particular towel that's a bit fluffier and thicker than the others. I'm making it sound like all my examples are to do with bathing, but through the day, make yourself more cups of tea than you ordinarily would. Just literally it's an open book. Just every waking moment, be nice to yourself. Don't rush. Treat yourself, because you have a deficit to make up. Okay, you didn't sleep, and you can't heal that with tea or towels, but you can at least rally around yourself to just make the day a bit more bearable. Because if you don't feel great, what can we do to make it better? And again, it comes back to the idea of stabilising and feeling safe again. If you go through the day just livid and just having a horrible day, because by this point you could easily hate yourself and you don't deserve a good day, and then you're not kind to yourself, well, that's just going to exacerbate the problem even further. It's important, if you haven't slept, to still exercise, and believe me, we're going to talk about exercise later. Don't do what I did for a while, which was to make the wrong assumption that because I didn't sleep well, I shouldn't push my body. I mean, okay, pushing your body is probably the wrong word, but I should give my body a day off. The internal organs didn't get the rest they need, so I shouldn't exercise. Don't do that. That's not the case. I spoke to doctors about this, and they were like, well, no, it's the opposite. Do exercise for all the reasons that you would exercise at any other time. Your body can take it. It's still rested. There isn't a direct corollary between whether you slept and whether your heart and lungs and so on is able to withstand exercise. Certainly not in the space of one night and how that night went. There's so many factors about your life in general that govern whether you should exercise. So don't mollycoddle yourself just because you had a bad night and wrap yourself in cotton wool, because again, that just gets things snowballing. If you go through the day and you don't exercise, because you're going easy on yourself, then you're less tired by the time you get to bedtime, and then you may not sleep again, and it goes on and on and on. So yeah, take not sleeping as reason to have an even better day than perhaps you would have had ordinarily. You absolutely owe yourself a few extra treats on those days. Finally, for coping, and this really is a huge one, accept. Accept what you're going through. Now, we're going to talk about acceptance more in the next video. This, unfortunately, is a concept that is still very alien to us in the West and much of the world, West or not. Accept what you're going through. You know why? Because it is what is. It is what it is. I know that's a vacuous slogan, but if you can accept, you suddenly stop fighting. And this is important, not just for insomnia, but for anything in your life. If you can accept, great peaceness can come. And so it's worth exploring the notion that you can't accept this. I can't be happy until, I can't be happy unless. And they're very dangerous phrases because you place conditionality on your own happiness and safety. With sleep, I spent many years being furious, hateful with myself, and completely failing to accept my predicament and what I was going through, and failing to learn from it as well. You know, I mentioned earlier that I didn't associate unresolved trauma with my insomnia, and I didn't see it as an opportunity. If you can accept what you're going through, and acceptance by its definition is something you do when things are not going the way you would like them to. It's easy to accept when you're great, because there's very little to accept. You're great. But this is the time to work on acceptance, and I cannot stress that enough, that you will find a direct line between the severity of your insomnia and how much you can accept your predicament. And that goes for any problem, not just insomnia. So yeah, from this point on, we're going to be talking about healing.